What did everybody think of our book?
It's interesting.
Well,
We got some
It's
of it about the
confusing.
third time.
it's confusing for me.
It is hard to understand the language sometimes.
It's Old English.
But of those scenarios that I did understand, I was amazed at the examples, like the examples of
Go on.
self-discipline.
Go
To
on.
leave the smelly water there, like, because that's going to be my incense now, and not all the incense I enjoyed in my life. So I don't change that water over there. It's so interesting.
It is.
I like the story of Macarius, who helped the robbers rob his cell. Like, take it.
I had a hard time with it.
What is she talking about?
That it's in the text. We'll come to it, but it wasn't from our reading from this week. What did you start to say?
Okay.
I said I had a hard time with it because of the small print in my book.
Mm,
I had to use my magnifying glass, so I didn't get very far.
Right.
You can fix that by downloading the book and putting it on your screen and making it bigger.
Ah, well, I'll try that then. Thank you.
I had a hard time with some of the references to women that were a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Yeah, negative, I guess I would say.
Yes.
Yeah, that the woman is the temptress, you know.
Right.
How dare you look at us, you know?
Even the poor mother was a temptation to her son.
I'm looking forward to book 5 on fornication.
That wasn't on today.
No, but after what was said about women and sex and so forth in the book 1 through 4, it will be interesting to see what a chapter devoted to that subject.
Okay, Ben.
All right, do I have the right channel?
I think so.
This is an R-rated channel.
You're in the wrong group.
Man, you did good.
Even when he objected to relaxation of the body, it's like, what? You can't relax your body? That was early on in one of the things.
Yes.
Something to give up. Yeah, second page, relaxation of the body in vain glory.
Right.
so lots of kind of challenging things. Were there things that people found meaningful?
Star Wars. It's extreme.
Well, let's jump into the text, and we'll kind of take the passages one by one. I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody just in case alarm clocks are going off or dogs are barking. My dog might start barking, so I'm not judging anyone. But so everybody's now muted, but feel free to unmute yourself if you have something to say, and then you can just remute yourself if when you're done speaking. But let's go ahead and start with in my edition 67. So the first number from book 1 of the Sayings of the Desert Fathers. Does someone want to read book 1, number 1 for us? Feel free to just unmute yourself and jump in.
Sure, I'll go for it.
Great.
A certain man asked the abbot Antony, saying, "What shall I keep, that I may please God?" And the old man answering said, "These things that I bid thee, do thou keep. Wherever thou goest, have God ever before thine eyes. And what thou dost, hold by example of the Holy Scriptures. In whatever place thou dost abide, be not swift to remove from thence. These 3 things keep, and thou shalt be saved."
Thank you. That's great. So, so somebody comes up to Abbot Anthony, so the great father of the Desert Fathers, the kind of most significant, if not the first monk of the desert. What do I do to please God? Like, if my whole goal in being out here is living a life pleasing to God, give me the outline. What should I do? And he says the 3 most important things are, wherever you go, have God before your eyes. So why would he say that? Why is that the number 1 thing that you do to please God? And feel free to jump in.
Because that's the commandment of loving God with all your heart, mind, and strength.
And perhaps also without in that intention and discipline, it's really hard for us human beings to do. We let a little crack lets it all come in from the world.
There's a doctrine of the church called the Doctrine of Omnipresence, and in our tradition, in just Christianity as a whole, we believe that God is not just filling all things. So it's not just that kind of part of God is over here and part of God is on Saturn and part of God is at the furthest reaches of the universe. But instead, the fullness of God is completely present at every point in time and space. So the totality of God is right here with me in this room and right there with Bonnie in that room and right there with Ben in his room. Like the fullness of God, we are always in the presence of. But so much of our life is spent living as though we are not in the presence of God at all, much less the fullness of God Almighty. And what would life be like if you were constantly aware that you were face to face with the source of all love, the source of all peace, the source of all joy? I mean, the definition of heaven is eternal life with God. But really, this life is life with God. We just spend the vast majority of our time ignoring him. At least I do. So, I mean, this guy comes up to Anthony. He's like, so give me your top 10 things I should be doing. What do I do? Like, do I need to like make more mats? Do I need to sell them? Do I need to read the Bible? And he's like, here's a good one. Be aware of the presence of God all the time, which is a really tall order. But if you can accomplish that, you will be the best Christian ever. And not just in terms of leading a moral life, but like, who can be sad when you realize that you're in the presence of the fullness of God? Or who can be angry in the presence of the fullness of God? Who can feel guilty in the presence of the fullness of God? Like if you live face to face with God 24/7, that's quite an amazing and wonderful life. And I think in a way it's so beautiful that this collection of sayings starts off with this one little dictum, because that's the whole point of living in the desert. It's to realize that you are in the presence of God all the time and to have zero distractions from that. So in this book, we hear a lot about the value of quiet, the rustling reeds and the tweeting birds, or distractions of people of the opposite sex or whatever it is. But the idea is not that rustling reeds are bad or people of the opposite sex are bad. The idea is that the goal in life is to only focus on one thing, which is the presence of God. Hard to do, but worthwhile as an endeavor.
That's the source of the monastic movement, right?
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, this is monasticism in a nutshell. And so then he goes on. So wherever thou goest, have God before thine eyes. In what thou dost, hold by the example of the Holy Scriptures. What does that mean? Why hold by the example of the Holy Scriptures in whatever you do?
Holy Scriptures are the Word of God.
Absolutely.
It's our guide. It's our guide.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, in part, there are sort of easy things to interpret how you hold by them. Holding to them is a harder thing, but it's easy enough to look at the 10 Commandments and say, okay, I'm going to try and not commit adultery, not commit murder. But in the Holy Scriptures are also the example of Christ. So it's not only follow the kind of basic moral teachings, it is in everything you do, live by the example of Holy Scripture, live by the example of Christ. And for the early church, we often forget this, but in the early church, the entirety of the Old Testament is about Christ as well. The Old Testament and the New Testament are all the story of Christ. And so for these desert fathers, your life was meant to be patterned on Christ. And we'll see that as we kind of get into this text. These guys and gals are so focused on living out the love of Christ, living out the selflessness of Christ, even though they live in almost total isolation. So in everything, let Holy Scripture be your example. So keep God always before your eyes. Let the Scriptures be your example. And in a sense, right there, you have the two great commandments. You're focused on God, you're loving God. That's number one. And then number two, you're living out this love that's exemplified in the life of Christ to everyone around you. So he's like, got this little request. And Anthony's like, here's an incredibly tall order for you. Go have fun with that. Like that's a lot to take on. And then, so these seem so important, so huge, so monumental and amazing and wonderful. And then he adds in, and whatever place thou dost abide, be not swift to remove from thence. So when you're somewhere, don't go away too quickly or too easily. Why would he throw that in? You have like almost the two great commandments and then like, you know, get a long-term mortgage. What is that about?
It reminds me of the Benedictine like stability vow, sort of the aspect of sticking with it. Basically, you know, no matter what happens, you're not going to run away or you're not going to change your mind or flip flop about, but actually sticking with it.
That is 100%. Please.
You know, not being restless and realizing that if God is fully with you all the time, then why would you need to go anywhere? You know, I mean, you wouldn't have to keep searching for God elsewhere or searching for meaning when you can be right where you are. And I think the whole world opens up. The more you spend time in a place, the more you love it, you appreciate God's creation. You know, you just find more and more about it. You know, even cracks in the walls can become these beautiful little designs or whatever. I mean, it's just, I think it's just tuning in and not having that restlessness.
And also perseverance. You must persevere because it's not going to be easy.
It's absolutely. I think all three of those are 100% right. This really is the origin of that Benedictine idea of stability. It's what they practiced in the desert, because you get out there and life is rough. And if you're just going to kind of go with your gut or what makes you feel comfortable or staying as long as you feel like staying, you're not going to be there long. And so you're not really going to get anything out of the desert unless you really commit to just staying in your cell. Mother Marianne, I love what you said. And it reminds me, Willa Cather has this novel, Shadows on the Rock. And it's about all these expats in 17th century Quebec. And they're all just like dying to get back to France. Everybody's kind of homesick. Everybody's kind of sad, with the exception of this order of nuns, because for them, every place is equally close to God. So whether they're out there in the hinterlands of Quebec, whether they're in Paris, who cares really? You're in the presence of God.
It made me think of a community also. The idea that if you're in a community, it takes time to develop relationships and knock off the rough places and, you know, that type of thing.
Absolutely, which is kind of the center of the monastic experience in a way. I mean, you think the community part is being maybe comforting, but it's also probably the biggest challenge for a lot of nuns and monks. That's absolutely right. Does someone want to read number 2? And I'm going to kind of skip through these because it's already 6:20 and we'll be here till 11 p.m. if we go through them one by one. But let's look at number 2.
I'll read it.
Great.
The Abbot Tembo asked the Abbot Antony, saying, "What shall I do?" And the old man made answer, "Be not confident of thine own righteousness. Grieve not over a thing that is past, and be continent of thy tongue and of thy belly." I thought the grieve not over a thing of the past is one of those things that's very hard for many people, me.
Absolutely. I think extremely hard for all of us. I mean, I think that so many of us really are prisoner to nostalgia or regret or to guilt, you know, of memories. But in the Screwtape Letters, C.S. Lewis points out that God doesn't exist in the past and God doesn't exist in the future. So God is only in the present. God exists under the conditions of an eternity. So he is in the eternal now, the eternal present. So anytime we're drawn into focusing on the future or into focusing on the past, we're really being drawn away from God. And so if we have guilt, we should just consign that to the mercy of God and move on. If we have regret, we should just get over it and live in the present. If we have nostalgia, we have to realize that everything good that we had then, in a sense, we have now, because all good things come from God and we are in his presence. So if there is a way to not be consumed by the past, then it allows you to actually focus on where you are now, which is in his presence. But it's a very hard thing to do.
And your use of the word prison in there, I hadn't ever really thought of it like that, but it's absolutely true.
That has overtones of forgiveness.
Absolutely.
Hard things about giving up the past is that you must let go of it, like a debt that's paid.
Yeah.
I think too that if we are quiet and we get all the noise out, and we sit quiet and meditate on the Lord, the thing that helps us get out of the past is to confess anything that we feel guilty about, or that we feel that we've done someone wrong, and ask God's forgiveness, and then be free of that. And that can be gone. And now you can concentrate on the now.
Yeah. Later in the book, one of the fathers will say, the devil loves nothing so much as an unconfessed thought. Not meaning that if you don't go to confession every Saturday, God doesn't love you, but meaning that, like, when you're holding on to a sort of secret or a guilt or whatever, and it's just between you and the four walls, it can feel just huge, and the enemy can use that to control you. And when you tell it to a brother, when you tell it to a sister, suddenly it kind of shrinks in size and shrinks in power over you.
I've heard a phrase, you're only as sick as your secrets. That reminds me of that.
Makes sense. And what about be not confident of thine own righteousness? And I'm sorry about the right one language that she uses here in the translation, but it's an older translation. Why be not confident of thine own righteousness?
Oh, that's pride. That involves pride.
Absolutely.
Like the Pharisees, I think.
Yeah. I mean, there's a sense in which when I feel like, well, I'm a really good person, so I can say this, then I say something terrible, like I say something awful that a good person definitely would not say. I kind of give myself a pass for anything. But also I think when you're kind of confident of your own righteousness, it can lead to a real complacency spiritually. I don't have to get on my knees and really search for God, because I mean, he basically likes me anyway, so what does it really matter? So there's I think part of the monastic experience, and really part of just Christian life, humility is a really essential component of that. St. Augustine said that pride is the source of all the vices. Everything bad that we do is really a species of pride, and humility is the source of all the virtues, which I think is really beautiful.
Well, none of us are really as righteous as we think we are.
Speak for yourself. No. Yeah, absolutely. I know we're all such a bunch of schmucks, and we kind of think, oh, what? I don't even know if I have anything to confess. But yeah. And why be continent of thy tongue and thy belly? What does that mean?
Well, I think to be continent of tongue means you don't overtalk, you don't reveal secrets, you're not verbose, you watch what you say, you don't talk gossip, talk about other people, you count your words. And now about the belly, I'm not sure.
So you're absolutely right with the tongue. So in part, the tongue can do all sorts of bad stuff, like we read about in the Epistle of James. Gossip is so destructive, malicious speech is so destructive, insulting, inciting people to anger is so destructive. But also, later on, we'll have this passage that we read for this week about there's the old man and then the young monks. They're on a boat together and they're all going to go see, I think it's St. Anthony. And the young monks are all talking about scripture, and they're talking about the fathers, and they're having this wonderful spiritual conversation. They're chatting the whole time. The older man says nothing. And he's like, yeah, they're good monks, but they really need to learn how to be quiet. Because I think so often we really do talk just to kind of fill space, or we want someone to be talking to us just to kind of not have to be alone with our thoughts, not have to be alone in silence. And for the Desert Fathers, like, silence was really what taught you. Silence was the opportunity to really focus on God. So if you're not continent in your tongue, even if you're speaking in sort of virtuous ways, it can still be destructive. The belly is because a big part of the monastic undertaking in the desert, maybe all the monastic undertaking in the desert, is something that in Greek is called ascesis. And this is it's an English word too, but it comes from the Greek word. It's the same in Greek and in English. And ascesis in Greek means training or exercise. Like, drop and give me 100 push-ups is a form of ascesis, but rather than physical bodily training, it is spiritual soul training. And so that's what these monks are doing. So in the process of ascesis, you are taking all of these voices that yell inside you, all these passions of, I want food, I want money, I want revenge, I want respect, I want a promotion. And you are telling them no. And you don't let them boss you around. You don't let them push you around. So a voice comes up and says, like, I want everybody here to know that I'm really smart, or I'm really holy, or I'm really rich, or whatever it is. And then you look at that voice and you say, no, people don't have to think that. Like, that's not where my sense of self comes from. It comes from being baptized. It comes from being a member of the body of Christ. And so the biggest, loudest of all those voices is the need for food. Because if you start telling that voice that needs food no, like, eventually you die. Like, if you don't eat, you will actually die. And so if you're able to be hungry and look at that hunger kind of in the face and say, no, you're gonna have to wait until tomorrow, then when the voice of anger comes up, you're like, I already dealt with hunger. So anger, you really have no power over me whatsoever. So being continent of the belly teaches you how to kind of have power over those other voices. It's these urges that kind of sweep over you. It becomes easier to control them when you can fight the kind of biggest, baddest one of all, which is your hunger. So these guys and gals don't sacrifice food because food is bad, or because you shouldn't be eating a lot, or because there are other hungry people that deserve the bread more. They're really just trying to control their passions. That's the whole undertaking, really. And it's not to be macho, it's to make room for God. It's to make room for more Christ in your life. It's to make your life more Christ-like. And it's also worth remembering what part of Christ's life this life echoes, which is what's a period in the Gospels that looks kind of like this.
When Jesus went to the desert.
Exactly.
And was tempted. Yeah.
And fasted the whole time. So for 40 days, he had no food. And that's also a kind of reversal of Eden. It's the do-over of Eden. So in Eden, the garden is completely full of every kind of gift, and all the animals are like furry forest friends. In the wilderness, the land is barren and there are no gifts. The animals, Mark tells us, are the wild beasts. In Eden, there's a fast from only one fruit. In the desert, it's a total fast. So Adam and Eve fall when the conditions are fantastic. They walk into the convenience store after just having eaten a 4-star Michelin rated, maybe, I don't know if Michelin even has 4 stars, but a 3-star Michelin restaurant. They're completely full, and still they steal a candy bar. Christ hasn't eaten in 40 days. There's a piece of bread lying on the ground that might belong to someone else, and he doesn't eat it. So it's like he's kind of overturning Eden through keeping this extreme fast when Adam and Eve failed to keep a very easy fast. So anyway, these guys and gals in the desert, fasting is a big part of what they do, and kind of continence of the belly is a big part of that monastic experience. So I'll kind of skip ahead a tiny bit. The Abbott of, this is just 4, the Abbott of Agrius said, certain of the fathers used to say that a dry and even diet joined together with loving kindness shall speedily bring them into the harbor of invulnerability. So this is just kind of following in on that. A dry and even diet. Dry eating means unpleasant eating. So it's like a lot of uncooked food. It's food with no oil drizzled on top, which is what these folks did. So it's just dry bread with a little salt, or it is just some like uncooked beans or whatever it is. So dry eating is still sustaining. You still are completely healthy and you're still building muscles and so forth. But it's not something you do for the pleasure of eating. So dry eating, this kind of continence of the belly, plus loving kindness. And so why the loving kindness piece?
Perhaps because without that, the dry eating really has no meaning.
Yeah, I think the loving kindness is like the anointing of the food, the oil, and you need that loving kindness
I love
to make it taste good.
That's so wonderful. And you know, the kind of Greek word for loving kindness, eleo, it's just one letter off from eleo, from oil in Greek. So mercy and oil, they're really intimately connected. So that the fathers would say, good one.
The fathers.
So let's see, maybe we'll kind of skip ahead a tiny bit. And let's see. Let's go to the one that Mother Mary Ann brought up. That was 15, I think. So in 15, the abbot pastor said, if a monk will hate two things, he can be free from this world. And a brother said, what are they? And the old man said, relaxation of the body and vainglory. Why are those two things that free you from the world?
I can understand the vainglory, but I'm not sure about relaxing the body.
Maybe relaxation of the body leads to complacently too, or to sloth, or to ennui or something.
Not what we normally think of as relaxing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like you have to relax at some point to live. You know, to sleep, you're relaxed. You know, I mean, it's
there's something
sitting up in your chair and it's a hardwood chair. You have to relax. I mean, you have to sleep. You know, I don't get it.
What did it mean back in their time?
It's a great question. So, you know, if you remember this is not too far removed from Judaism. So it's kind of interesting to look at the Jewish roots of some of this thought. So if we're looking at contemporary Jewish texts in the Mishnah, there is a statement about how in this world we are composed of body and soul. That's what a person is. And in the world to come, we're composed of body and soul. That's what a person is. But in this world, if you are completely neglecting your soul, but you're still feeding the body, you might feel okay. People wouldn't look at you any differently. You know, if you come into your doctor's office and he says, how's it going? And you say, you know, I haven't read a book of poetry in like 6 months. I haven't said a single prayer. And I would love to go on retreat. Your doctor will be like, no, how's it going? Like, how's the cholesterol stuff going? How's the broken bone going? I'm not interested in like what you do for a hobby. Because in this world, it's kind of all about the body. And the soul, it can be neglected and you might not notice. And in the world to come, according to the Talmud, according to these rabbis writing around the same time, it's the same in the life to come, but they're swapped. So in the life to come, everything is about the soul, and the body can be relatively neglected. You're still soul and body, but your body doesn't need a lot in the life to come. Your soul needs a lot. And that when we are living in this life, our job is really to prepare for Olam Haba, for the world to come, the life to come. And so we should be feeding the soul, but we kind of forget to because it's not as obviously in need. So when our goal in life is relaxation of the body, we are kind of serving the body and often at the expense of the soul. We might be making sacrifices for our comfort. So I might say, my vocation in life is teaching, but teachers don't really get paid a lot of money. Teaching is really hard. Teachers don't have a lot of prestige. It's really thankless work. So I'm going to become a drug dealer instead, because that's a lot of prestige. That's going to make me a lot of money. It's going to be a lot easier. So I'm going to make these sort of sacrifices, in a sense, for the sake of relaxation, for the sake of these worldly concerns. You'll notice that that the question is not, what must I do to please God, or what must I do to be saved, or what must I do to follow Christ? The question is, what must I do to be free from the world? And so in a sense, to be free from the world is being free from the desires of the body for relaxation, for food, for X, Y, and Z, and then being free from vainglory, being free from what the world says about you, or if the world even cares about who you are, what you do, what you've done. So if you are totally free from the needs of the body and the opinions of others, the world has zero grasp on you. There are no sacrifices you need to make for the sake of the world. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It sounds to me like what Paul said, I must decrease, that he must increase.
Yeah, it's very Pauline, isn't it? I mean, Paul was so willing to be whipped and shipwrecked, and he's like, I think all this is fantastic. I'm a huge fan when I get beaten up for the sake of Christ, because then I know like I'm on the right track. So it is very much this super ascetical kind of reduction of value of the body in that way. But these are hardcore guys and gals. This is not sort of junior Christianity like I practice. These are really intense. Let's read let's see. Why don't we go on to 19? A brother asked an old man, how cometh the fear of God in man? And the old man said, if a man have humility and poverty, and judgeth not another, so comes the fear of God. What's that about, do you think?
By fear of God, I think it means not as we think being afraid, but to love, honor, and respect.
Yeah, so phobos in Greek, fear, literally means the urge to step back from something. So that could be step back from, a guy wielding an axe, or that could be stepping back from a Cezanne painting. Oh my gosh, wow. So I heard someone once describe, someone who told me this at West. I was presiding one day. I wish I could remember who it was, but it was wonderful. Someone said that they had read in a book that the fear of God was the feeling that a 3-year-old gets the first time the elevator doors open at FAO Schwartz. Oh my gosh. And it's phobos, the fear of God is really awe before God.
Okay.
But it's not comfortable. I mean, it's not sort of like, oh yeah, it's nice to be back at my grandma's house. Instead, it is really like, oh my gosh, like I am standing face to face with love himself, with joy himself, with peace himself. The source of all beauty is staring me right in the face. So it's not, I'm afraid you're going to hit me, but it's also not complacency or just sort of being comfortable. So, I mean, I think that's why in our tradition, when we enter the church, we are quiet. We might genuflect. We might kneel in prayer. We might just look at the cross, look at the tabernacle. We have this real fear of God in our tradition. That's not being scared of God, but it is awe before the Lord, before not his wrath, but his beauty, his holiness, his goodness, his peace, his love, the joy that he imparts. So in a sense, that fear of God, like the psalmist says, the fear of God teaches wisdom. The fear of God is kind of the goal of the Christian life. It is living before God's presence. So why are these 3 things the route to get to the fear of God?
Don't you have to empty yourself to be in awe of God? You have to give up. You have to have humility and poverty and stop judging others.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, if you're so focused on yourself, how do you have awe before God? Like if you're focused on why I'm better than another person, or how I want to gather more riches, or whatever it is. And I think it would be easy to just say, this is about material poverty, which it is in part. I mean, these guys took vows of literal material poverty and had nothing. But I think there's also this component of spiritual poverty, kind of like in the parable of the publican and the Pharisee, where the Pharisee is completely full of himself, and the publican, this tax collector, this kind of tool of the Roman Empire, is just pouring himself out to God, and he is just utterly empty. He's so aware of his own spiritual poverty, even though he was probably much more wealthy than the Pharisee.
Well, it's not our job to be proud. It's
Yeah.
not our job to be rich or to be the judge.
Yeah.
Those things keep us away from the awareness of God.
Yeah. It's true.
Just a bit further ahead in book 17, there's this one part that says, said the Abbot Antony, I do not now fear God, but I love him, for love casteth fear out of doors. And I think it's really interesting because like the desire for like
Ruth, we lost you for a sec.
material. Oh, sorry.
No, please.
The
desire for.
But like the desire for like material goods, like to be admired and respected, is born out of fear, because it's like, I think it's like a lack of something, and it's a fear of not having enough and seeking things in, things that don't really matter. So when we love God, we experience only him, and we aren't forced to experience anything else that isn't really worth our love, I guess.
That's so wise. I love that. Absolutely. I think Abba, Pambo, whoever is talking now would be like, yes, you totally get that.
I was also thinking that as if we're kind of full of ourselves in every way, that we also might not even recognize who God is. We might have brought God down to sort of our level so that we don't have that sort of awe and wonder. We just think we're all on the same playing field, and it's that we lose our sense of wonder and awe when we think that we're just so wonderful ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
It seems to me that involved in the fear of God is a knowledge of who God is, and exact, in a more full way than we would know otherwise. If we continue to judge people, etc., we won't know that fullness of God, and involved in the fear of God as we're talking about it here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think when we start judging, we kind of put ourselves in God's place. So, I mean, there's only one judge. And when we take over that job, we're really doing a job we're very unqualified for. And it's hard to pay attention to the one who is the actual judge when I'm setting myself up as the center of the universe and the arbiter of good taste and who's right and who's wrong and so forth. So we're running a little short on time. Are there other specific ones folks want to talk about?
All right, go ahead.
Hey, Father Birdie.
Please.
This is Woody.
Hey.
A long time ago, I heard something, and this makes sense, that these are really extending the Proverbs.
Yeah.
The Proverbs is, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom.
Absolutely.
This sort of says the same thing. And the other thing is that I heard a long time ago that from a sermon at Grace, by the way, that if you want to really dig into and think about what you read, anytime you read the word fear, and I think we've almost said it, exchange that fear for the love and then reread it. It works for almost every proverb, and it works in all these that I've read in this book.
That's wonderful. And I think awe is also a good kind of good addition to that as well, because it's sort of an awareness of the greatness of God, but it's definitely not being scared of God. So we have all this stuff in the New Testament and the Old Testament about the fear of God as this positive thing, but then you have Christ saying to the disciples, "Be ye not afraid." You know, I mean, this is also something that comes up a lot when they're in the boat, calming the storm. There are various times when they get scared, and he's like, "Don't be scared. Like, I'm with you. God incarnate is with you." So it's kind of this tension that Ruth brought up between like fear is a positive, but also love even kind of trumping fear itself. I mean, in a sense, like love is all we actually need. Like St. Augustine said, when you learn to love perfectly, you no longer even have need of scripture. So I'm with you, Woody.
I got in a conversation a few years ago with a former priest at Grace about fear of God. And I told him how I felt it meaning love. And I like the awe part too. And he tried to tell me that no, fear means actually fear. Weren't you ever fear? Can you be afraid of your father? Do you have fear of your father? And I argued with him. I said, no, I don't believe that. And I stood my ground, but he tried to tell me that no, fear is actually being afraid. I said, no, I don't think that's it. I wasn't going to believe that. I knew what it was. I can't believe that.
It's funny I don't know. If we as Christians believe that Jesus is God incarnate, like, who would you be less afraid of than Jesus? You know, I mean, the most loving human ever to walk the face of the earth. Like, so if that's what God's like.
Yeah, I said, why would God want us to be afraid of him? He wants us to love him. I could not get that over to him.
Yeah, I'm with
Carolyn, that sounds very much like a Baptist.
Well, this was not a Baptist.
I know.
Let's see. Let's look at one of the passages that kind of are challenging in bringing up women. What's one of those, I wonder?
Let's see. Oh, on page 71, which would be, let's see, number 7. Let's see.
Yes, that really puts a woman in her place.
Yes.
So at one time, when the Abbot Arsenius was living in Canopus, there came from Rome and hoped to see him a lady, a virgin of great wealth and one that feared God. And Theophilus the archbishop received her, and she prayed him to use his good offices with the old man, that she might see him. And the archbishop came to him and asked him, saying, "A certain lady hath come from Rome, and would see thee." But the old man would not consent to have her come to him. So when this was told the lady, she commanded her beasts to be saddled, saying, "I trust in God that I shall see him. For in my own city there are men to spare, but I am come to see the prophets." And when she came to the old man's cell, by the ordering of God, it chanced that he was found outside his cell. And when the lady saw him, she cast herself at his feet. But with indignation did he raise her up, and gazing upon her said, "If thou dost desire to look upon my face, here I am, look." But she for shame did not lift her eyes to his face. And the old man said to her, "Hast thou not heard what I do? To see the work is enough. How didst thou dare to take upon thee so great a voyage? Dost thou not know that thou art a woman, and ought not to go anywhere? And wilt thou now go to Rome and say to the other women, I have seen Arsenius, and turn the sea into a high road of women coming to see me?"
Egotistical.
But
really?
said, "If God will that I return to Rome, I shall let no woman come hither. But pray for me and always remember me." He answered and said, "I pray God that he will wipe the memory of thee from my heart." And hearing this, she went away troubled. And when she had come back into the city, she fell into a fever of sorrow. And it was told the archbishop that she was sick. And he came to comfort her and asked her what ailed her. And she said to him, "Would that I had not come hither, for I said to the old man, remember me. And he said to me, I pray God that he will wipe the memory of thee from my heart. And behold, I am dying of that sorrow. And the archbishop said to her, knowest thou not that thou art a woman? And through women doth the enemy lay siege to holy men. For this reason did the old man say it, but he doth ever pray for thy soul. And so her mind was healed, and she departed with joy to her own place. So I think it has to be remembered that on the one hand, we're still living in very sexist times, but we got nothing on the 4th century when this stuff is being written, when women couldn't inherit property, when women were considered a form of men's property. So like this is written at a really different time. That's kind of to bracket that, and that's true. But it should also be remembered in kind of balancing that men were not allowed into virgins' houses, like in the houses of religious women who had retired from the world that were either widows or virgins, so not married women. So you would have these societies of religious women who would not see men at all. And so this is a rule that goes both ways. So if there was a wise, like on the next page, we'll be hearing about one of the desert mothers. And if a man had traveled from Rome to see her and hear of her wisdom, she might have given exactly the same answer. And there's the sense that, like hunger, our sexuality is one of those places where we just kind of can't really control ourselves. And it's not the idea that like, something romantic was going to happen then and there in the desert, but that the enemy might attack this monk in his thoughts for days or weeks or years through the vision of this woman. And in the same way, the enemy might attack an abbess for days or weeks or years through the vision of a man. It's a very, it's a kind of different way than we often think and talk about sexuality. But on the other hand, most people, I think if you ask them on the street, would say they don't watch pornography, and yet pornography is the biggest business on the internet. So someone's watching it, so it's like, certainly that is a huge moneymaker and a giant part of our economy. So we might sort of pretend that we've sort of evolved past this place, but have we really? Is prostitution like no longer a thing? I think that like, it's easy for us to sort of pretend we're these kind of perfect mental beings and we just like bodily stuff like that. That's kind of old fashioned. We don't even care. But like hunger, I think sexuality is a place where we have passions that wash over us and they influence our thoughts and our actions. Sexual assault is still very much a real thing. There are all kinds of bad decisions that get made that are influenced by sexuality. And so I think it's easy to kind of dismiss this writing, but if we contextualize it, there's also something to be learned from this, I think. Not to say that, we're not monks and nuns, so we should be mixing with one another. But these people made a choice to have no distractions. And so knocking together reeds are a distraction, twittering birds are a distraction, hunger is a distraction, sleepiness is a distraction, and sexuality is a distraction. So they're really intentionally trying to live free from that, if that makes sense.
So is there a suggestion? Is there a suggestion then that if you were a woman and you wanted to seek wisdom, that you would go out specifically then to find a desert mother instead of a desert father?
Yeah, there's always this tension in the desert fathers and mothers, because on the one hand, they are these sources of wisdom and people get so much from them. And on the other hand, the whole reason they went off into the desert is to live in isolation. And so like Abbot Anthony keeps moving further and further and further and further out, and then finally like walls himself off behind these like giant impenetrable walls and won't see anybody. So in so many of these stories, people come to the desert fathers and desert mothers, and the desert fathers and mothers say, get out of here. I'm trying to pray here. Like I can't receive any guests today. So I think that for all of them, there's not always this sort of like open welcome for anyone. I don't know if women more typically sought out women. That's kind of what I would imagine, and vice versa. We see later there's an episode in which a group of kind of desert mothers are walking past, and there's a young monk, and he sort of has to like avert his gaze and kind of makes a big to-do about like, okay, I'm going to look away now. You know, I'm not going to be tempted. And the desert mother walks up to him because she has authority. She has spiritual authority over him. He's a young monk and she is someone seasoned in the desert, and their gender is not an issue. And she says, if you had been a real monk, you wouldn't even notice that we were women. So she's like teaching him about spirituality, which it's interesting that this monasticism is an area in which men and women do have equal authority. It's because it's about the sort of years in the desert. It's about the wisdom you've acquired. It's about your relationship with Christ rather than where you fall in society, which again, you know, radically sexist times in which women were a form of property. So it's an interesting dynamic.
I think Freud might have some fun with this as well.
Well, I mean, Freud would have fun
Because
with being a Christian.
basically-
He thinks we're all crazy.
When I think that, and I understand the sexuality part of it, but women have always been accused of being temptress, no matter how non-temptress they might be, depending on the will of the man. And I thought it was very conceited when I was reading this. It reminded me of the high school phrase many years ago when people would say, oh, he thinks he's God's gift to women. When the fellow said, and then you'd go back to Rome and all these women would want to come out and see me. God's gift to women. That was ego. I wouldn't say that was sexuality. That was just plain egotistical on his part. So he still thought he was a pretty good, a pretty manly man, in my opinion.
In some ways, these people, I think that they understand human sexuality maybe better than we do, because we kind of downplay it and say, oh, you know, it's not. And yet our whole society is permeated with sexual things that go on that are not really very good for our society. And so when I was a kid, my grandmother, I had a chaperone all the time. And I thought my grandmother was kind of nuts. But as an older person, I look back on that and I think, not really. She really understood, you know, the way it was. And I didn't understand, you know. So even though this is sexist in many ways, in some other ways, I think they had a better grasp of what, you know, what was going on sexually.
It's kind of sad. I feel like we've sort of fallen into this false dichotomy between, on one hand, you have sort of extreme Puritanism, and then on the other hand, you have like, sex is no big deal, whatever. It's, you know, just having lunch or something. And there's nothing in between. Whereas in fact, the truth is very much somewhere in between. And I think that you're right. I think the Desert Fathers had a much stronger grasp of what it actually was.
I know that you mentioned before that there was one thing that was of such great value that hardly any of the Desert Fathers had copies of the scriptures. And when they say that one of the three things you should do to be closer to God is that you remember the scriptures. And I think of Jesus and how he had wonderful relationships with women and did not regard them as just terribly tempting. He gave them his respect. I think of the woman at the well. He could have just passed her by and not even given her the time of day, but and there's all the people who were devoted to him, all the Marys that followed him all around. The monks that are the desert, I don't know that that's going to be a part of their awareness of how their God, when he was on earth with us, looked on women.
And I do think it's always important to, in thinking about these things, remember that the same was true for women talking about men from the monastic perspective, right? Men would not be allowed into a convent. Men would not be allowed into the presence of holy women, not to protect the women, because the women did not want the temptation from the men. So on the one hand, 100%, I agree with you, absolutely. Like our Lord certainly didn't discriminate in who he interacted with, and he broke all sorts of social conventions and mores to show his love to absolutely everyone, men, women, children, without question. But I do think that even though we're talking about a ridiculously, incomprehensibly sexist time, a big part of what's going on here actually has to do with this idea of isolation from temptation, both for women and for men, rather than an expression of, a pure expression of the sexism of that period.
The other piece of this is if you, I mean, because I was kind of shocked when I read this, but if you put it in the context of the many things that are talked about here that are things that get in the way of your loving God. I mean, it's everything from women to, excuse me, I'm not trivializing that, to wine, to reeds soaked in water, to other abbots that don't respond in an appropriate way. And if you put it in that larger context, this is one of many things which at this point, at this time, were challenges to the focus on serving and loving God.
And I think it's also important to remember, I mean, to Ben's point, that there's a sort of mediating figure in this story about the wealthy woman from Rome as well, who is this archbishop. And the archbishop, you know, she gets sick and he's showing up at her hotel room. He's like, hey, let's hang out. You know, can I bring you some soup or whatever? Like, it's not a all Christian men have to be anti-women, all Christian women have to be anti-men. This is really something specific to these monks in the desert and nuns in the desert. And if you, to this day, if you go to any cloistered order, a men's order, they would not allow women in. A women's order, they would not allow men in. So if you become a monk or if you become a nun and you're going into a Carmelite house and your dad is dying and he's like, I just want one last cup of coffee with my daughter, the abbess is going to be like, she's a Carmelite. You can write her a letter. You know, men are not allowed in.
I think the Archbishop skated by the whole sexuality thing. I think he just harkened back to the story of the garden and the enemy working through Eve, whether that's believable or not, to tempt Adam. I think he took an easy way out. Excuse me, Archbishop.
So I mean, again, this is super sexist times, but I do think there's more going on here than just the pure sexism. And I think that any theology which does have a sense that like women are lesser or women are further from God or further from Christ or should have less autonomy in their spiritual life, that's really not based on scripture. That's really not our form of Christianity at all. So I think if we do find that in this, we have to reject it. But I don't know that that's necessarily what's going on here. I don't think it's necessarily a devaluation of women as much as it is a very hardcore separation of men and women. Neither the twain shall meet. Apparently in Orthodox Judaism, if one starts thinking about what heaven is like, one has to realize that you will never see your spouse again because heaven is segregated. Men on one side, women on the other side. Interesting.
Well, you know, the desert fathers and mothers went there to totally strip themselves of every part of their humanity so that they could purely be in unity with God. Anything that was a distraction as far as the body, the mind, they wanted to be totally pure. And that was their goal. That was what they were striving to do. So anything worldly that would distract them from that goal of total union with God, that's what this is all about, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're someone who speaks with experience, having lived this life for 6 years.
Also, the Archbishop said that the monk was sure to pray for her.
Yeah. Ever doth he pray for thee. So not just like he's going to say a prayer for you, you are like front and center in his prayer list henceforth. He just doesn't want to think about your face.
But what was he praying? Was he praying, keep her out of my mind? Or was he
No.
praying for her well-being? He could have
No.
been praying that keep her out of my heart, out of my mind. She's a temptation. She's a Jezebel. Keep her away from here. Or he could have been praying, this is a woman who is seeking advice on how to find God. We don't know.
She was very wealthy. So,
he was
I don't have a lot of faith in this archbishop anyway.
He was praying, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on your servant, and using her name. This is how the fathers prayed for those who asked their prayers. So it wasn't about him. He was praying for her.
For her. Okay.
Arsenius is an interesting character. So this guy who she goes to visit, Arsenius is one of these really famous desert fathers. And he had been an extremely powerful courtier. He may have even been like a governor of a province or something. So he came out into the desert and left a life of incredible luxury. He's also the one who like keeps the palm leaves in the same water forever. So it's like his hut is incredibly stinky all the time. And he says that I do this as sort of an antidote to these perfumes that I smelled for years, because he lived this life of incredible luxury. I think it's Arsenius, we'll read later. He comes out into the desert and another monk walks into his cell, and Arsenius has made like a little bed of like hay or something, and he's sleeping on a bed. And this monk is like, you're not even a real monk. You can't even sleep on the ground like a real monk. Like you need a little bed. Oh, sorry, Arsenius. I thought you were so holy, but like you have to like have these little luxuries. Like get real. You're not one of the holy great monks. And Arsenius says, well, tell me, what did you do before you came into the desert? And he said, I was a shepherd. And he said, well, so you were used to sleeping on cold, hard ground. He said, yeah, that's what I did every day of my life. So he said, so coming out to the desert, sleeping on the ground was not a transition for you. It was not a big deal. No, not a big deal at all. What did you do? And Arsenius said, I was the governor of a province. And for my whole life, I've slept in a huge feather bed. It was perfumed. I was woken in the morning by servants. So for me, it's a big deal. It's a big change. So he's sort of an interesting figure in the desert, just kind of an interesting biography. I'm going to skip ahead towards the end of our reading in book 4. So we have in, let's look at 20.
Oh.
Abbot John of short stature, John the Short, said, once when I was climbing up the road that leads to Skeet with palm leaf mats, I saw a camel driver, and they began speaking and rousing me to fury. And I dropped what I was carrying and fled. Why did he drop what he was carrying and just flee, just run away like he had seen a ghost?
That one made no sense to me. Could not get that.
Was he running from his own anger?
Yeah, 100%.
He was doing what?
Running from anger. So anytime we have a temptation to anger, we are opening a window into our heart for the enemy. So anger for the brothers, for these mothers and fathers, was seen as one of the most dangerous temptations. So there's another scene in which a bishop comes out to visit one of the Holy Fathers, and he brings a bunch of treats. He brings, I don't know what it is, a roast duck and some bottles of wine or whatever. And the Holy Father says, oh, I've been out in the desert for like 40 years. I haven't had a bite of meat since I came out to the desert. I can't touch this duck. And the bishop says, oh yeah, I've been keeping a fast too since I was ordained. Since I was ordained, I never allowed anger to pass my lips. And the Father says, oh, your fast is much greater than mine. Like meat is no big deal. Anger, that's a big deal. And there are all these different examples from the Desert Fathers about the sin of anger. And it's interesting. It's another sort of jarring thing for our society, because we sometimes think about anger as a good thing. We talk about righteous anger, anger motivating you to do things. Someone offends you and you get angry back. You kind of fight fire with fire. But for these Desert Fathers and mothers, anger was one of the chief tools of the devil. It was one of the chief ways in which he tried to control you and own you and make you do his will. And anger was always something to be fought against, to be striven against. How does that strike everybody?
Well, a number of years ago, I became so angry at someone who had treated me very badly. And within, less than a week, I think I was in the doctor's office and then had to have some heart treatment because of that anger. More complicated than that, of course, but it's true.
Yeah, anger poisons yourself, I think.
Well, there is actually that changes the chemistry in your body when you're angry. And I don't know, there are certain times in certain places when anger, I think, has a good point in raising adrenaline. If you see someone kidnapping a child, make you angry and go do what you need to do. But as far as just general everyday anger, that can't be helpful, in my opinion. And I don't think that kind of blocks that's a sin in that it blocks us from the flow of God between us. When there's anger, they're blocking it.
I think it's like taking poison and hoping the other guy dies.
Yes.
Yes.
And it's also true when you get angry that, I mean, your amygdala just goes off faster than your, prefrontal cortex can. So you just lose all judgment. You can't respond in a way that is reasonable at all.
The Desert Fathers talk about how anger is always a sin. There's never a good reason for anger. Anger is always something to be run from. So, even if you're carrying these mats that you've spent 2 weeks making, they're the only thing you have to sell for bread. Like this, you're holding in your hands your whole resources. If somebody's going to make you angry, drop them and run. Like just get out of there, because anger is much worse than not having bread for a week or two. The virtue that sort of replaces anger, or is kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum of virtues and vices from anger, is zeal. So we talk about anger as a motivator, or righteous anger or whatever as a healthy thing. They would always say that's bad. Zeal is love and concern for others, is love for God. So you can act in all things with zeal. I sometimes think about how in the 60s there were all sorts of different people who are activists in various ways. But I really love how Dr. Martin Luther King, I think of him as this wonderful example of zeal rather than anger, because it's, at least in his speech, he seemed to be just as concerned for the salvation of the Klansmen as he was for the people that they were persecuting and beating. I mean, I think that he was really responding out of love for these oppressed people and also love for their oppressors. There was a sense that it was never okay to turn to violence, and that everything had to be done with love and an eye towards the kind of healing of a society. So it's a sort of like zealous way of being rather than an angry way of being, which I think is quite beautiful. What did you all think of the guy who said the monks had to move away from the clacking reeds? That even a bird can distract you, and if you have these reeds around, how can you possibly be quiet? Did that seem crazy?
Well, yeah, it did to me, but I also, sometimes I get lost in all the double negatives and some of the comparisons. I don't follow the thread, so I'm looking forward to what people think about that, the reeds. Because I didn't understand it.
I mean, I think in part, I know that I have such a temptation to surround myself with noise. I get in the car and I put on the radio, whether it's news or music or whatever, and I get home and I end up looking at my phone, or I'm like turning on the radio here, or we're watching a movie or something. And there's this kind of constant temptation to have like input coming in. For these guys and gals in the desert, there was a sense that they wanted to really resist that need for input. and really just sit in total silence, have nothing to latch on to, have nothing to focus on but God himself, but being in the divine presence, which I think is hard to do.
Father Birdie, I know that personally I'm someone that I love silence, and it is hard to find in our modern world. I mean, even sitting in my, my room or whatever, there's somebody with a leaf blower outside, or there's, people driving by, or there's, someone's got the TV on or something. It's really, even if you seek silence, it's hard to find it in our modern society. There's very few places that are actually quiet like that.
I was a little confused, because it talked about, I kind of like to go out and listen to nature, the birds singing and all those, the quietness and everything. But then they talked about the reeds being a distraction and the birds being a distraction. I think I'd go crazy if I was in total silence.
And I mean, I think in a way, like the project of the monks and nuns was to go a little crazy in that way. It was to really like be face to face with total silence. There's a great movie about modern hermits that live in community that are part of the Carthusian order of monks called Into Great Silence. And it's this long, wonderful documentary. It's like 2 hours long. And it's made by this German filmmaker who is allowed to go into a Carthusian monastery and just film for a couple of weeks. And this project happened because in, I think, the late 70s or early 80s, this filmmaker wrote the abbot of this order a letter saying, I'm a person of faith, and I would just love to tell the story of this order and kind of invite people into the life that you live, because it's a cloistered order. They're never visitors, so people don't really know what it's like to live this life of silence, because these monks do not talk to each other. They live in total silence 24/7. I think it's like once a month they get to have an hour of conversation time. And so he wrote this letter in like late 70s, early 80s, didn't hear back. In like 2007, he gets a letter from the abbot of this order, said, we've been thinking over your proposal, and we've decided that we do want to invite you in to film. And they just live a different life with a different scale of time. They're just focused on different things than we are. But if you kind of want a little taste of that life of monastic silence, it's a film that's worth watching. It's really beautiful. But there's almost no dialogue, and it's like 2 hours long. What about, let's look at book 4, number 2 and 3. These are kind of interesting. And maybe we'll finish with the end of book 4. So in book 4:2, the abbot Daniel said of the abbot Arsenius that he would spend the night in vigil. All the night through he waked, and when towards morning he craved for very nature to sleep, he would say to sleep, "Come thou ill servant," and would snatch a little sleep, sitting, and straightway would rise up. And then 3, the abbot Arsenius said, "It sufficeth a monk if he sleep for 1 hour, that is, if he be a fighter." Why don't they want sleep? What's that about?
Are dreams holy to them?
Not really. I think if you asked them, they would say certainly sometimes God manifests himself in dreams like he did to St. Joseph before the flight into Egypt, but also the enemy manifests himself in dreams, and your dreams can certainly lie to you and lead you into dumb stuff. So I don't think it was about dreams per se.
This is about the relaxation of the body thing again, about not giving in to sort of any sort of comfort.
Yeah, like hunger, sleep is one of those things that's very hard to resist. If you've ever tried to do an all-nighter, like that is really hard. And then if you try and stay up all the next day and all the next night, like good luck. That's really brutal. Your body is just saying, I have needs and you have to respect my needs. Like my need for rest comes before any other project you might have. And I'm going to throw that in your face over and over again. And so if you can stay up all night in vigil, if you can stay up all night in prayer, then it's a way that you learn to tell your body no. The needs of my soul are just as important as your needs. Obviously, sleep is important. And even this guy says like he sleeps as little as he can, but he still does go to sleep. But it's just another way to kind of say no to those passions.
It seems to me that that goes against the natural, the things that we consider natural about the body.
Yeah.
Sleep, eating.
Absolutely. And the fathers would call them the blameless passions. So there's nothing wrong with a desire for sleep. There's nothing wrong with a desire for food. Like these are actually good things that benefit your body, but they are still these forces that try and control you. They're not evil forces, but if you get really good at telling those blameless passions no, then when you feel anger rising up, you read the Facebook post, you're like, I can't believe you say that, you moron, I'm gonna write a response. If you're already used to being able to say no to sleep or no to hunger, when anger comes along, you're like, anger, pshaw. I've been saying no to sleep. Anger's easy. So it's kind of a way to train yourself for Christ-like behavior.
Makes sense.
So towards the end of chapter 4, we have a little bit on discretion. Let's look at 26. They told of the Abbot of Agrius that if he were making holiday with the brethren, and wine was brought, and he drank for the brethren's sake, he set this bond upon himself, that for 1 cup of wine he would drink no water for a whole day. And the brethren, eager to give him pleasure, would bring him wine, and the old man would take it joyously, to torment himself thereafter. But his disciple, knowing the reason, said to the brethren, for God's sake, do not give it to him, for he brings under his body with torments thereafter in his cell. And the brethren, when they know it, gave him no wine more. What is that about?
Oh, he suffered for giving in to that, whatever the wine did for him. He had to purge himself from what he felt was like somewhat sinful or giving in to a weakness. So he punished himself for giving in and accepting.
Yeah, I think in part, yes. I think in part, just these monks in the desert were supposed to have no luxuries, and wine was a luxury. So I don't think he had like an addiction to alcohol and he was like giving in and then feeling really bad about it. Instead, he was actually living in incredible humility. So he let these brothers think that he was kind of like, like a lax monk, like not a very good monk. And like, if there was wine around, he was gonna drink it. Like, let's party. All right, boys. Yeah, what do you got? And so he had this, they would offer him wine and he'd say, sure, absolutely. Like it says he took it joyously. So he would actually rejoice in having a glass of wine or 2 glasses of wine or 3 glasses of wine. But then he didn't want to let his passions have a hold on him. And so he would say no to water for 3 days for those 3 glasses of wine. And there's this idea in the desert of discretion, that you are never doing something for the eyes of others, but only to please God, only to grow close to God, only to be more Christ-like in your life. So to these guys, he seemed like kind of a lax, easygoing, not very good monk. But in the secrecy of his cell, he was still very dedicated to his ascesis, to his practice of self-denial. But I don't think it was punishment so much as training. So it's kind of like, the professional athlete who decides to have 2 pieces of birthday cake and then hits the gym for an extra 3 hours the next day because he has a big and he's trying to work really hard just to make sure he does well on the field. But it's not punishment for the birthday cake.
But isn't that being deceptive? I mean, he's letting the brothers think that he's enjoying this. That's not a good example.
I mean, he even says he takes it joyously. the interesting thing about these guys and gals is that they were very upfront about their own weakness and their own failings. I mean, I think that the idea of setting an example was often something that didn't even enter their heads, because they're like, I am such a sinner. Like, I'm such a failure. Like, it's only Christ is sustaining me. So who am I to be an example? There's a story, I can't remember if it's from this collection or not, of Abba Moses the Strong, who's one of the great monks of the desert. And there's a monk who's done something wrong, and so they're going to have like a sort of little trial. And so they call Abba Moses because he's so wise and he's so holy, and they're like, you should be the judge. And he's like, I can't be the judge. And they're like, no, you have to come be the judge. And Abba Moses says, absolutely not. And they're like, please. They keep bugging him. He's like, fine, I'll come. So they're all there. They're ready for the trial. The trial's at 1 p.m. and it's 1 o'clock, and Abba Moses isn't there. They wait till 2 o'clock. They wait till 3 o'clock. They're like, is he not coming? Did he lie? Is he not going to show up? And they see him way off across the horizon, and he's coming and he's carrying just some really heavy burden. And they see a little stream running out from this giant sack that he's got. So he's trudging across the desert, trudging. They see him coming from a long way away. He finally gets there, and there he has this giant bag full of sand with a hole in it. So sand's running out like an hourglass. And they say, Abba Moses, what are you doing? And he says, well, I've come here to judge my brother, carrying the weight of my own sins, and look how they run out behind me. And so the trial's over. He can't judge a brother. So I think the idea of setting a good example, or kind of being more holier than thou in a sense, was what they were really trying to run from. Well, anything else in our last couple of minutes that we should say about book 1 through 4? In spite of the foreignness and in spite of potential sexism and other aspects, are there still things of value here for you all?
Yes, I'm amazed.
Yes.
It's definitely relevant to my life.
Me too.
I guess because we're human beings, and they are too. And God is God. Nothing's changed. They are running from.
We've all had some experience with being a little more isolated than we've been for a long time. It's kind of help us kind of know what it was like to be away from all the people or the world that you've known.
Yeah, I picked this book for 2 reasons. One, because I think it's just the kind of source material for all Christian spirituality. It's such a classic of Christian writing. But 2, because we've all kind of had this weird isolation experience.
Yes.
It's different. It's just different.
All done.
Other thoughts? Please.
This is not, I hope if there's more, I hope there's no more discussion, because I had 2 things that are on topic, but not quite.
Please.
If you go to St. George's College Jerusalem website, you can take a tour of the wilderness, as well as some of the little caves and desert fathers and mothers. So
wonderful.
Nice video out there that John and I watched after last week to kind of bring us to what it was really like to live out there.
That's wonderful.
Pictures are wonderful.
What was it called?
I'll put it in the chat right now. St. George's
Okay.
College. This is where several of us went on a trip last year. Holy Land. It's the Anglican College, or the Church of England College in Jerusalem. It's wonderful.
There are 2 separate videos of the wilderness, so they're both really worth watching. So that's really good. And then the second one is Daughters of the King. This many years ago, but we did a book called The Desert Mothers. And it's by Mary Earle, and it actually is all the practices translated into modern life. If you're trying to get closer and you want to use some of the practices of the Desert Mothers, so it's got some disciplines and prayers, and talking a lot about the silent finding silence in your life and that kind of thing. So
That is wonderful. The Desert Mothers by Mary C. Earl.
yeah.
And we're actually going to read the lives of a couple of the Desert Mothers. We'll read Saint Mary of Egypt and Saint Pelagia. So we're kind of reading about their spirituality as well. Anything else before we go our separate ways?
What's
Are
the
we
reading
going to
for
get
next time?
together?
Absolutely, yeah. So next week, next Wednesday, we will look at 5, 6, 7, and 8, which in my volume starts at page 79 and ends at page 100. And I mean, I think there are some folks like me who just eat this stuff up and love it. There are some folks to whom it's pretty weird and out there. And so if you want to sort of read in those chapters, don't feel like you have to just like plow through the whole thing. If you want to sort of pick out the parts that are meaningful to you and we can discuss them, or if you want to go through the whole thing, anything is great. But it's just fun to get to read this stuff with y'all and think about these wonderful people.
Father Birdie,
Yes.
With everything opening up now, what's the plan for getting together in church?
9:30 on Sunday. Be there.
We can go in and sit down and
outdoor service at Central at 9:30 this coming Sunday. It'll be our first.
Outside.
Mm-hmm.
So even though the governor said everything's opened up, we're still going to be outside.
Yeah, because the separation of church and state, it's really our bishop that we listen to rather than the government. So we're still asked to be outside, but we are moving back into outdoor services, and then as the numbers continue to decline, we'll be moving into indoor services. But we have to wait until we have permission to do that. But 9:30 Central. Just make sure you RSVP so we have a seat for you. I talked to some folks at West about, and Mother Mary Ann talked about the possibility of an outdoor service at West as well. And Holly Deckard, who spends a ton of time there because she does so much Altar Guild stuff, she did some kind of serious looking and serious research, and she just said, I really don't think there's a good outdoor space at West. Because
there isn't.
Trash, there are dumpsters, the field next door is real rattlesnakey, like it's just not ideal. We continue to be in negotiations for this piece of land. A contract has gone back and forth several times. It's now with their lawyers again. But once that gets settled and we have our piece of land, then we'll have a beautiful spot near West to start doing outdoor liturgies. So fingers crossed. And then I am so ready to be back in church. As soon as it's safe to do so, you can't hold me back. I cannot wait to start worshiping indoors again. I'm with you. All right. Well, I will see you all next Wednesday. And read as much or as little as you like, and we'll talk about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Father Birdie.
Bye.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Sleep tight. Don't let the bed bugs bite.
Or stay up as you like.